All right, I am just going to go over some of the major concepts related to blood composition and the function of the various blood cells. And I will just start with a brief overview of blood and its composition. Although it doesn't seem like it, blood technically is a connective tissue. Usually we think of connective tissues as being things like adipose tissue or like tendons and ligaments, but blood is actually a liquid connective tissue. And it consists of plasma, which is the liquid matrix of blood. And it also consists of blood cells, which are called formed elements. And these are solid particles that are found in the plasma. Just a little bit about blood plasma. You can see here, this is a real vial of blood. Here it is separated. The plasma is located in the top half if blood is centrifuged so that the contents of blood separate. And at the top is the plasma, the liquid part of blood. It's mostly water. It's about 90% water, about 10% solutes, which are things like electrolytes, sodium, potassium, and also plasma proteins, which are unique to blood. They're only found in blood. They're synthesized by the liver, and they have a few different functions. Also nutrients like glucose, gases like oxygen and carbon dioxide, and hormones are found in blood. As far as the formed elements go, these make up about a little bit less than half of total blood volume. Plasma is about 55% of total blood volume, and the formed elements are about 45%. So there's three main types of formed elements: erythrocytes, shown here, which are the red blood cells; leukocytes, which are white blood cells; and thrombocytes, which are the platelets in the middle. And actually, 2 out of the 3 of these formed elements are not actually complete cells. Erythrocytes, for example, they don't have many of the organelles that most cells do. They don't have a nucleus. They don't contain mitochondria. And then platelets are actually cell fragments. They're formed when a really large cell breaks apart into all these little tiny pieces, and that's what the platelets are. Okay, so let me start with the erythrocytes. Okay, here we go. So major characteristics about the erythrocytes, which, like we said, these are the red blood cells. They have sort of a unique shape. They're like a disc shape, and they're also called biconcave. That means they kind of sink in on the top and the bottom. That's what concave means. Also, I mentioned they are anucleate, which means that they lack a nucleus. And in addition to that, they also lack a lot of the other organelles too. It does have a benefit though. And that benefit is that it allows more room for hemoglobin. Red blood cells are filled with hemoglobin, which is a protein shown here, which carries oxygen. And that is the primary function of the red blood cells, because they contain so much hemoglobin, they can carry a lot of oxygen. Also, since these red blood cells don't have mitochondria either, which is another type of organelle, they are not performing aerobic respiration. Remember, we learned about that process with the metabolism unit. Aerobic respiration is the process that it actually uses up some oxygen to produce a lot of ATP molecules to provide energy for cells. But red blood cells do not perform aerobic respiration, which means that they're not using up any of the oxygen that they carry. Therefore, all of the oxygen that they are carrying can be delivered to other cells and tissues throughout the body. The term hematocrit refers to the percent of red blood cells out of the total blood volume that you have. An average hematocrit is somewhere in the 40s, 40%. So for females, it's usually a little bit lower. It's maybe 41, 42, 43%. In males, it's a little bit higher, maybe 46, 47%. And the total count for erythrocytes, it's done in millimeters cubed. So if you can imagine a little tiny cube, 1 millimeter in height, width, and length, so very, very small. There are about 5 million erythrocytes per millimeter cubed of blood, which is a lot. This is definitely the most abundant of all the formed elements that you have in blood. The term erythropoiesis means the production of erythrocytes. It's really important to maintain a steady amount, a stable number of erythrocytes in the blood, because they are providing oxygen to your body's cells. If you have too few erythrocytes, it can lead to hypoxia, which means hypo means below or under. So there's less oxygen getting to your tissues, which is not good. Also, if there are too many erythrocytes, you might think there can never be too many, but there can be, because if there are too many, it can make blood too viscous, which means blood gets too thick, and it can actually clog some of the small blood vessels in the body. So normally erythrocytes are produced at a rate of about 2 million per second. They are constantly dying, so they need to constantly be replaced. It is that process of erythropoiesis is controlled by a hormone called erythropoietin. That is a hormone that's produced by the kidneys, and it stimulates erythropoiesis. So normally there is just a small amount of it that's constantly circulating in the blood, that's maintaining that steady production of erythrocytes. But if there's suddenly any drop in the number of erythrocytes, or if your body detects a drop in oxygen, then that can lead to suddenly an increased production of erythropoietin, so that you would have an increased production of erythrocytes. That sudden drop in oxygen levels could be due to maybe like an extreme injury where the body's hemorrhaging and losing a lot of red blood cells and losing a lot of oxygen. It could also be due to being in an environment where there's a reduced availability of oxygen. That can happen if you travel to like a really high altitude. If you're climbing, Mount Everest, for example, the higher in elevation, the higher in altitude you get, the less oxygen that's available. So that could trigger an increase in the production of erythropoietin, and therefore the production of erythrocytes. So erythrocytes, I mentioned that they're constantly dying. They only live for about 100 to 120 days, and then they die, and they need to be replaced, which is why you do typically have erythropoietin constantly being produced. When red blood cells are broken down, they're filtered out of the blood by the spleen and by the liver, and then they're broken down. And a lot of the components of the red blood cells that are broken down get recycled to make brand new erythrocytes. So now I'll go over the leukocytes, which are the white blood cells. And remember, these are the only ones that actually are complete cells. They contain nuclei, they contain all the normal organelles. If you remember, the count for erythrocytes was about 5 million per millimeter cubed. For leukocytes, it's only about 5 to 10,000 per millimeter cubed. So there's a whole lot less of these in the blood than erythrocytes. These white blood cells protect the body from diseases caused by a wide variety of things: bacteria, viruses, parasites, toxins. So they have a protective function. And there are 5 different types. Each one is sort of specific to a specific thing. Neutrophils perform phagocytosis, which means that they will go up to a foreign bacterium or foreign, anything that's recognized as being foreign and that doesn't belong in the body, and they will surround it and basically digest it. So they perform phagocytosis, and that's mainly, at least for the neutrophils, that's mainly to destroy bacteria, any bacteria that might get into the body. These are usually the first ones to reach the site of damage in the body if you have any kind of injury. Eosinophils, these are designed to fight parasitic worms. So like a tapeworm, for instance. They are also involved in allergic responses and asthma. Basophils, these are the third type. These are involved with allergic responses. They release histamine and also several other chemicals that cause inflammation. Histamine is also an inflammatory chemical. And then we have monocytes, just like the neutrophils. These also perform phagocytosis to destroy bacteria. These, I mentioned, neutrophils are usually the first cells to reach a site of injury. It usually takes the monocytes a little bit longer to reach an area of injury, but usually there's more of them that come. And then the fifth type are lymphocytes. These are found in the lymphoid tissues, which are part of the lymphatic system. And if you remember, we covered that in the very first unit. So lymphoid tissues are like the spleen, the lymph nodes, the tonsils, the Peyer's patches that are located throughout the GI tract. And so these lymphocytes hang out in the lymphoid tissues, and that's where they perform their immune functions. There's actually two types of lymphocytes, B cells or B lymphocytes and T lymphocytes. So another thing I talked about with the erythrocytes was their lifespan. They live for about 100 to 120 days. For the leukocytes, it varies a lot. The neutrophils, eosinophils, and basophils, those are the first three that I talked about. They tend to have a pretty short lifespan. A lot of them will actually die off as they're fighting like the bacteria that invade the body or other microorganisms. So their normal lifespan is like a few days. But for the last two types that I talked about, the monocytes and especially the lymphocytes, the B cells and the T cells, these have a longer lifespan. For the monocytes, it may be a few months, but for the lymphocytes, it is years and years. For some of them, it can be like your entire lifetime. So they last for a very long time. And then the third type of blood cell are the thrombocytes. These are also known as platelets. And I mentioned in the beginning that these originally start out as like really large cells called megakaryocytes, and then they rupture and they fragment into all these little pieces. And that's what the platelets are. They're little fragments of that really large cell. So just like the erythrocytes, these are not complete cells either. A normal count, oops, let me switch my slide here. And so a normal count for thrombocytes is in the hundreds of thousands per millimeter cubed. So for erythrocytes, it was 5 million. For leukocytes, it was 5 to 10,000. And for thrombocytes, it's like, 200, 300,000 is normal. So these are somewhere in the middle. Their lifespan is not very long, a few days. So 5, 10 days maybe. And when you're looking at this picture, I just want to point out this is, this is a view using the microscope of blood. So this is a real picture of what the blood cells look like. The red blood cells are the most abundant ones. These are the ones that look sort of like a pinkish color. All of these are red blood cells. Then the two large purple cells that you're seeing in the middle, those are the leukocytes. They are the only complete cells, remember, so they're going to be the largest. They also have nuclei in them that are sort of oddly shaped. That's the dark purple area that you're seeing in the middle of each one. And then finally, the platelets, because they're only cell fragments, they are the smallest. They are these, what these arrows are pointing to, these really tiny purple dots that you can kind of see. There's another one right here, kind of scattered around. So that is what the blood cells actually look like in real life. So I'm going to stop the recording right there.